So, good afternoon. You're all very welcome to this webinar, which we've entitled Warming Up a Cold House, Ways Forward for English, Irish and Ulster Scots. It's part of the Learning Festival, which Darren Strabane District Council are organising, and we at Ulster University are delighted to be part of it. We think that this is a really important topic, and we hope that you will participate with us in thinking about these issues of language and culture and literature and how we go forward together here in Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland. So you will be listening today. The way we're going to structure this afternoon is I am the chair. My name is Duncan Morrow. I am Professor of Politics at Ulster University. I'm actually based in Jordanstown. And then we're joined by Dr. Neil Comer, who is a lecturer in Irish at Ulster University in Magee. And then by Frank Ferguson, who is the Research Director in English Language and Literature at Ulster University in Coleraine. So we are making a contribution here, and I'm really delighted to the Learning Festival for the Northwest today. The shape and form of this is that I'm going to ask Neil and Frank just to introduce the topic with a few thoughts and issues, and to get you thinking. They'll speak for about 10 minutes each. I have said that after 8 minutes, I will indicate to them that we're getting towards the end, so that we try to keep that short. And then maybe I'll ask a couple of questions just to get the conversation going. But we really do want this to be an open webinar. So I want you to direct you to the chat function, which those of you who don't know Zoom is at the bottom of your screen. And please, if you have a question, if you have an issue, if you have something you want to raise, please put your question on the chat function so that we can put that question to the panelists and keep this conversation going, because really we do want this to be a public conversation. And the more we can have participation from yourselves, the better. And the other thing to say is that we are recording this. We're recording this because we think it could be useful to people who are not able to make the webinar but may want to use it in the future. And we hope to learn ourselves from this as a way of working. So please feel free to tell your friends, and when it's put onto the online, the link will be posted. So having said that, can I then move to the actual webinar itself? We are joined by two people who really have thought and worked and been active in the field of language and of literature around many years, but also in a practical and in an academic way. So they've both been engaged in public and thought about this in their academic work. And so I'm going to ask Neil Comer to go off first. He's the lecturer in Irish at UU in Magee, as I said, and he will be looking at the place of the Irish language and its development here.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. I suppose there are three issues that I want to look at as part of this, before we get into an open conversation about the different issues and the issues that are brought up by Frank. And I suppose the first thing is I want to look at a historical context to the Irish language in Ireland, and particular in Ulster and in Northern Ireland. And also then I'd like to move on and talk a bit about the main threats to minority languages, obviously in the context of Irish in modern society. And then talk very briefly about what ways Irish can be developed as a community language in non-traditional Gaeltacht areas. So they're the three main focuses. And again, within 10 minutes, it's difficult to do a full broad sweep, but hopefully I'll give a general overview of some of the issues and some of the things that we need to think about. I suppose if we look at the historical context to language in Ireland, that we have to realise until the beginning of the 17th century, Ulster, as well as the whole of Ireland, was pretty much an Irish Gaelic speaking area. There had been a brief attempt during the 14th century with the statutes of Kilkenny, etc., to stop the Gaelicization of the Anglo-Norman lords. And I suppose this is maybe the first point where we can point to the beginning of other languages, Latin, French and English, being used in administrative circles in Ireland. Previous to that, the Irish language was very much to the fore, and Latin obviously in ecclesiastical surroundings. But really we need to look at the 17th and 18th centuries as the main factors in the language shift. The plantation of Ulster, for example, in the early 1600s resulted in land which had been owned by the Gaelic Irish being forfeited and given to natives of England and lowland Scotland. And these, for the most part, were English speakers. And this had a huge part to play in the Anglicisation process in Ulster, and particularly in the eastern counties. You have to remember, this was previously a monoglot population, so bilingualism sort of would become the new norm as English was consolidated as a language of administration and law in Ireland. This is throughout Ireland. This said, prior to the famine in 1845, it is estimated that Ireland was home to between 3 and 4 million speakers of the Irish language, and this was more than any other time in the history of this language community. And anyone who's interested, there's a book by Nicholas Wolfe called An Irish-Speaking Island, which sheds new light on actually the number of Irish speakers and their engagement with society. It's difficult to know how many of these speakers were in Ulster, but there's no doubt that in the west of Ulster in particular, there were significant pockets of native Irish speakers. The famine, as we know, the famine had a huge impact on the population of Ireland, and death and immigration caused a drop of probably 25% of the population. And this was pretty much a disproportionate number of these would have been Irish speakers from poor backgrounds. The language shift that happened can be looked at in two ways. There's a thing that's called diglossia, which is where you have two languages being used by the same community, but in different and social economic situations. And you get this throughout the world. And this happened for a while in Ireland. But then really the language shift has happened, and Irish becoming a minority language came through a thing that's known as transitional bilingualism, where you have the monoglot Irish-speaking grandparents of the sort of early mid-1800s who raise bilingual children, who then raise monoglot English-speaking grandchildren. So you have this language shift that happens within 3 generations. And we see this happening pretty much the 1800s is when this starts to become a major factor. This and the prohibition of Irish in schools, and also because immigration to the United States and Canada became a big factor for the Irish population in the 1800s in particular, the importance of learning English became even more relevant. So this was the picture for the Irish language in the late 1800s. And I know I've just actually jumped from 1400s to the 1800s, but it gives you a general overview of where the language was. The language was in rapid decline at the end of the 1800s. Then the revival movement, which was led by Conor na Gaeilge, known also as the Gaelic League, this started in the sort of late 19th century. And the early years of the revival were pretty successful, and sort of the idea was to reinstill a sense of pride and usefulness in the language. And this, in the early part of the 1900s, the revival was gaining ground. Irish was being introduced into the school system for the first time. Children who were brought up in Gaeltacht areas were being educated through the medium of Irish. That was a major shift away from the language decline. But then when the political scenario changed on the island of Ireland after the partition in 1922, there was a very, very different approach taken by the two new jurisdictions, for want of a better term. The new government in the Republic of Ireland took an approach to revival in one way, and the government was controlled everything. In the north, you had a situation where, whilst there were still pockets of native Irish speakers in Tyrone, Antrim, Armagh, Derry, and you can take Cavan and Monaghan, as part of this as well, if you're looking at Ulster, Irish was still a community language, albeit in a minority, but it was a community language. The revival movement became very much a community-driven movement because Irish was not encouraged and was removed from the curriculum, from the new curriculum in the north, and the newly formed government wasn't in favour of the development of the language. And this really was the case for the next 40 years. The only situation that we see Irish in education in schools, in particular grammar schools, fee-paying grammar schools from about the 1930s, to the 1970s, is where the Irish language still existed. That's done in primary schools, but very much it was a voluntary movement of people running night classes, running faces, which are like festivals where you recite poetry, etc. and then, of course, attending the summer colleges in the Donegal Gaeltacht. So this was the extent of the Irish language in Ulster, and in particular within this new jurisdiction of Northern Ireland, where there was no huge support at educational level. And I say this remained the case until about the early 1970s, when you find yourself having a community-led movement in the Shaws Road in Belfast, which decided that, you know, there was a community of houses built up, and this was built around the idea of Irish medium education, which started off in the 1970s and faced an immense struggle for 10, 15 years, until this huge growth that came from the sort of late 80s through the 90s, and which continues to grow now. So you find yourself from a situation of a pretty bleak situation, I suppose, right up to the sort of mid 70s, 80s, until this massive community involvement and this community interest in Irish, driven by Irish medium education, brings the language to the stage that it's at now. And it's probably healthier now. And again, I don't mean to say that everything's wonderful and all is rosy in the garden, but it's the Irish language is probably in a better state now than it has been in a long time as a community language here.
2 minutes.
Yep, 2 minutes, good. Oh my God, I've still so much to cover. You know, if we look at the threats to minority languages, and maybe we could actually, I'll come back to the bit about the threats to minority languages in general, but it's very important. I talked about the Shaws Road development. The ways that Irish can be developed as a community language is very important and is key to any sort of revival. And if we look to the developments in Carntoher, for example, outside Mahara, which in the past 20 years has gone from an area in which the language was practically non-existent to now having a very, very successful and thriving Irish language community. And this was done, this wasn't just didn't happen overnight, but was based around the idea of Irish medium education and bringing the children out of this, bring the language into the community, having parental involvement, having sort of the normalization of the language through sport, etc., and basically creating a critical mass of speakers, which wasn't just through teaching them Irish in school. So I know I'm coming toward the end, and actually I didn't get through half of what I wanted to say, but hopefully this will come back within the chat. But you see how quickly things can move and how quickly the dynamic can change from one of, you know, the language had declined to this close to extinction, and then through community involvement, but with governmental support. And that's very important. I'll come back to that hopefully later in the discussion, that language can be revived, but it has to be revived at community level, and it has to be revived from community up. And if there isn't a buy-in from a community, it won't work in general. So look, that's a very, very broad overview of what I wanted to say, but hopefully, as I say, more can come in the discussion later. So
thank you very much, Neil. That was very helpful, and I'm aware that 10 minutes is quite a tight deadline to keep to. I'm keeping to it because I want to make sure people can ask their questions. So if people have questions now, I won't ask them to Neil now, but if they want to record them in the chat, then I will note them and I'll come to them when we get to that point. I've given Neil the opening 10 minutes, and now I want to turn to Frank, who has been research director, as I say, in English language and literature, but a strong interest in Ulster Scots as a culture and as a language and as a history and inheritance. So Frank is going to now look at some aspects of the development and survival of Ulster Scots.
Okay, well, I suppose one of the things that people are maybe expecting is that I'm going to launch into something that completely disagrees with everything Neil says, and it's not the case at all. I think one of the things.
thanks.
I think the other thing the other thing, if anybody's sitting out there watching this, that they'll have heard the words Ulster Scots, which will already have set up some kind of reaction, because I think one of the issues with Ulster Scots is a very old chestnut as to whether it's a dialect or a language, and not wanting to say anything against that Neil has said, but I'm going to say that Ulster Scots actually helps complicate our idea of what language is in Ireland, and particularly in the north of Ireland. And my stock response to people who say, well, what is Ulster Scots? I'll say it's a language in the sense that Scots is seen by these people who adjudicate what languages are. So Ulster Scots is part of Scots, comes from that language family, which in ways is separate to English as a language. But it's also can be seen as a dialect too. So it's your have your cake and eat it in a linguistic sense. I suppose the other thing that complicates it is sometimes we think about two languages operating in Ireland, and particularly in the province of Ulster, but it's really probably a case that there are at least three languages operating, because a lot of the toing and froing between Scotland and Ireland meant that often Scots was the was the language that people used to communicate with each other. To look historically, Ulster Scots has always sort of sat in a difficult space, and this is one of the times that in a way we can see similar anxieties about disappearance and similar anxieties about the status of the language, because both Ulster Scots and Irish were up against the more powerful, for want of a better word, language of English, and often fell down in that in terms of administration and politics and prestige. So both languages have had that difficulty. I suppose the other difficulty is from an activist's point of view, that looking at an Ulster Scots language movement, it's probably started a lot later than Irish. So it's not really, it can't really be seen in equivalency to that. So, from looking at all the resources that Irish has, sometimes Ulster Scots gets very, jealous in a way, because, you go into a library and you look at the books on the shelf for children and for learning, and you see all those resources and you think, that would be a great idea for Ulster Scots. So in many ways, it's playing catch up. I suppose the important thing to remember is that it is something that is a community language that has existed in Ireland, since the time of the plantation and beforehand. It probably was strongest, a bit like Irish in some ways before the moves to revive it. It was probably strongest in the 18th and 19th century, before industrialization and modernization, and particularly the school system, which came in to sort of eradicate so-called bad or slang. And this is one of the things, and this I think actually is something that we still deal with in Ulster Scots, the sort of revulsion that sometimes people have when they see something that seems to be bad English. This actually might well be good Scots, but there's a very early inhibition against that. And this is probably one of the things that we overcome. Probably one of the things that people don't realize as much is that it's actually had quite a long literary life. Scots has appeared in print in Ireland since the start of the 18th century, and had a long history of people writing in this as a creative medium and as a medium of recounting day-to-day life, and that aspect of its community and its creative side is probably something that we underestimated as researchers and people who look at the heritage and history of what we have here. I would say there's a difficulty in being the we language between Irish and English for Ulster Scots. While Irish can be seen in some senses as a minority language, it's also a national language, in the same way that Scots in Scotland is seen as a national language. We're sort of in between a number of the houses, and sometimes Ulster Scots isn't really sure how to deal with this. What that does actually show up is that Ulster Scots is like a lot of other minority languages across Europe and across the world, who are maybe the smaller player amongst other big players. And sometimes we probably haven't found our way in to talking both to English and both to Irish. and this is probably something that we need to deal with. Ultimately as well, one of the things we can get hung up on most is the idea that all these languages are distinct from each other, and that we have a belief in a sort of monoglottism, and that English speakers in this part of the world only speak English. Well, given the interplay between Irish, Scots, and English in this part of the world, actually there's a lot, it's one of the things I imagine that Irish speakers tell non-Irish speakers when they're learning Irish, that you already have a lot of Irish, in the places that, the local places and townlands, and the way you say things, and in the vocabulary you use. And we often forget of how much of a mixture of English, Ulster Scots, and Irish we actually are as a people, that sometimes we need to think of our spectrum of the language we speak rather than separate languages, and indeed not actually having a connection to those other languages. I'll maybe stop there, and I can take questions, because I sort of feel I could ramble on this for a long time.
Thank you very much. I think that was a great introduction. I suppose what might be interesting to look at is how important is it to maintain languages? I mean, is it just important to the speakers? Is it important to cultures? But from your perspective, what is it that languages bring that if they were to disappear, we would lose? Either of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, we talk about the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, and that's one thing. And I think that has to be a big part of the conversation. But I think, and it's very important, I was interested in what Frank was saying, I mean, languages, this interaction that has happened between Ireland and Scotland, going way back 1,000 years longer, this is what has formed the very unique place. In particular, if you look sort of the North Coast, etc., our place names, our vocabulary, our surnames, sports that we play. And this is things that aren't known to everybody. And I'm not purporting to be an expert in every aspect of this, but, the language is a key sometimes to a door that has been locked to many, many people. And, you find yourself, and identity is important to everyone, but you need to know, to feel comfortable in yourself. This is how I feel anyway. You certainly do need to know the surroundings that you come from. I can say, for example, my knowledge of Irish has given me a huge insight, for example, into geography, and that is through place names, etc. And this has also led on to a knowledge of history, a knowledge of music, a better appreciation of the foundation of lyrics, for example, my ability to look at lyrics of songs that are written in Ulster Scots or Irish or whatever. So this language as something which maybe consolidates your own sense of identity is hugely important. But it's also, as I say, it's an opening to a past and hopefully to a future where you can appreciate things a lot more. That combined with the cognitive benefits of being bilingual, I think sort of sell bilingualism and sell the importance of language themselves.
Very good. Frank, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things about words, it helps us to know ourselves when we understand what we're really saying when we say something. That there's something incredibly powerful about the so-called the idiolect, the personal language that we all have, and this comes from different places, and you only have to see our fondness for something like the word "we" to know that that's different to a small thing. A wee minute is very, very different to a little minute or a little bit of time. It has a specific meaning within the context of the community and the family and the world in which it comes from. So on one hand, I think it's really important that we know these languages, because they speak to us as human beings, and indeed they speak to the deepest core of who we are as human beings. The other thing is, and the really important thing I think as well, language is a form of communication. And how can we understand the people next door or in the next room, sometimes if we don't understand their language and treat it with a certain amount of dignity, because we'll only know what they're really saying when we understand the forms and the systems in which they speak in. And it doesn't mean that somehow by learning this, we somehow morph in to that person, but we give it the dignity and the respect that it deserves, because we understand, you know, this is all part of understanding who we are and who you might be out in the world. So I think it's really, really important to do that.
That's great. I mean, I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please do get typing away into the chat, because we will make sure that they're put into the general question. The image I get from both of you speaking is that the languages are somehow part of the, if you like, the fabric of living here, and that somehow or other you can't really understand the fabric of that if you don't have contact with and also some engagement at a personal level with what the language is saying and conveying. And I suppose I just ask you to reflect a bit on what the minority languages, the issue that has come up all the time, of course, is what role should they play in the public life? And Neil talked about English becoming the language of administration and the language of everyday commerce and so on, and that's definitely true now where we are. And the question for minority languages is, how important is it to have them as vehicles within that space? Or should they just be kept within, as you said it needs to grow the community up, Neil, but I mean, what kind of support do languages actually need from the public space, and what is actually not helpful? Actually, that may be another question there.
Well, I mean, this is a question that has been very much discussed, excuse me, over the past number of years, in particular with the the push for legislation for Irish language, etc. And this isn't a new question. And one of the main factors, if we look at the decline of the language first, because before you go to revive something, you have to look at the factors that caused the decline. And one of the major factors was the loss of Irish as an administrative language, the loss of Irish within a certain a class of speakers, and I mean that in the best possible sense. If we look at the situation now, and I'll use a personal example for this. I've endeavoured to raise my children through Irish as much as possible, and as a family language, it's been fine. There's no problem. We can converse and do a lot of things, and we've seen, for example, then that with local developments, they can play sport, they can attend different things through Irish. My eldest daughter, for example, has just got her driving license, and she just opened her first bank account, and all that had to be done through English. Now, to me, that somewhere where the language has got official recognition, to me, that lessens the importance of the language in the eyes of the speaker, and particularly the eyes of younger speakers who see, well, I can only use this language in certain aspects of my life, so therefore its strength and its development and its security in the future is diminished by the fact that somebody is picking and choosing as to when you can use the language and to what level you can use it. So I feel that's the role that certainly government has to play in making sure that speakers of the language don't feel that they're being excluded from certain areas of society because services, etc., aren't available in that language. I do believe that all of this has to be very closely analysed, and I don't feel for 1 minute that it should just be a broad brush across the board. But I do feel that to make sure to secure the future of the Irish language, and I can only speak for Irish here, to secure the future of the Irish language, that the appropriate support is there. So that's my feeling on it, and I know that what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. So that's my view on how the government can.
There may not be a right answer or a wrong answer to that question. I think it is certainly an important question, though, as to if it's required, what kind of requirement would be there. Frank, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult one, because sometimes it's not, for, one rule for one doesn't necessarily mean that the other necessarily wants it at this stage. And I know there's always been a lot of resistance from native speakers of Ulster Scots about some of the administrative language that is used to, that portrays itself as Ulster Scots in government papers and whatever. So I think it's difficult, because I think sometimes if you're trying to develop Ulster Scots, that you want to move away from this sort of tokenism that some of those gestures focus on. Maybe there's more things needed to preserve and stabilize the development of the language, rather than things that often antagonize people. It's also very tricky as well from a rights point of view, and from trying to administer this within any legislation, that in a sense whose rights are more important, and how many languages do you include them on various materials, given that there are other minority languages in the province that sometimes might be more helpful in having something, rather than just having something in Ulster Scots. I think it's one of those issues as well, that Ulster Scots for a long time hasn't been part of the fabric of administrative prose. So unless we want to necessarily go back to a sort of 17th century Scottish court system, it's very hard to do that. It's not impossible, but again, I think it needs some sensitivity and seeing what could be done and what should be done for speakers.
Yeah, because I'm quite interested in, I don't want to over push this aspect of the language, but in the idea that while there might be broad frameworks of rights and so on, that this is something which could benefit from a broader conversation, not about yes or no, but how best to bring languages into a kind of future-orientated discussion, so that they belong in some sense to the whole community, but are given the proper protections. And that sometimes the yes-no of politics is probably the wrong way to be dealing with this, but that you need some frameworks, obviously, and some decisions. So it's not to say you shouldn't have politics around it. It's simply to say that actually we need more complex conversations around language than the ones we're having.
Yeah, I think that I think what's vital in the movement forward in this, and I think what seems to somehow be missing in this conversation, and not in this particular conversation, but in the overall conversation, is that the issues for both languages are so complex that the idea that if legislation is put in place for Irish, for example, that the same legislation will work for Ulster Scots, or vice versa. Yeah. That, to me, that approach actually is more damaging to both languages than it is beneficial. For example, if there's a request, or there's a feeling for bilingual place names in an area, and that request comes through from the Irish language community, and there's no demand for Ulster Scots, is it necessarily beneficial to put up trilingual signage? And this is just an example. I'm just using place names as an example of, or likewise, if a request comes from, say, the Ulster Scots community to produce literature in schools, the poetry of John Hewitt or whatever, does there have to be a like for like in Irish? No, there doesn't. And I think that this is where the conversation, a far more detailed and a far more complex conversation is needed by both. Don't want to use the organisation, but by both movements, for want of a better term, that the Irish language community has quite a developed approach to what it feels is needed to protect and sustain the language, and that's based on conversations with minority language movements throughout Europe and throughout the world. And I think that if we sit down and see, excuse me, what are the needs of both communities and how can we best move this forward? And this doesn't have to be a conversation in isolation. There are things that the Irish language community can learn from the Ulster Scots community and vice versa. That's okay. I mean, that you know, these aren't the both movements shouldn't be mutually exclusive, but at the same time, they don't have to be complementary. You know, and this isn't to say that one movement should receive more funding, for example. That's not the case at all. There should be an equity there, absolutely. But the idea that one thing works for both all the time to me is a very, very narrow approach, and it's something that we need to move away from that.
There are a couple of questions that have begun to come in the chat function, which is great. And I will turn to one of them, which comes from Seamus McConaughey. And he is putting the point which he says, I suppose I'm asking Frank this a bit. What do you say to the point that Ulster Scots is really is within the English family and therefore is already kind of fully promoted, if you like, in the public space, whereas and therefore the kind of parallelism kind of falls off at a certain point?
Well, I suppose a couple of things, and in a sense, it's a very good question, because you know, English is a world language, and sometimes we can forget this is not just the main language of the UK. It's a world language which has its own complications as well, and you know, as we know, in the 21st century, often the language we see internationally is American English, rather than British or Irish or Ulster English. Standard, though, I think once you begin using Ulster Scots as standard English, I think Scots speakers here and in Scotland might feel that that's not necessarily the case. That if you drill down into what is standard, that there might be massive differences. Certainly, if you look in a literary sense, if you look at the work of Burns and you look at the work of Scottish writers and Irish writers, before and since, it's very hard to say that that's standard English. And in many ways, this is a literary heritage that we don't necessarily grasp too well. And one of the reasons that perhaps we maybe need to grasp it well is that some of our best writers, and I include Seamus Heaney in this, had very, very good awareness of the Scots language and the Scots literary tradition, and this played into his works. So if we, yes, of course, we can always say English is the common denominator, but that could also be used, and it has been used in the past, against Irish. So I would be careful of using that as a reason to sort of keep Ulster Scots out, because I think that loses our very particular, it goes back to very 19th century view of English, in which the only things that people read were English novelists and English male novelists. It takes a lot of the inclusivity and the reality and the uniqueness out of the way even English is used here. So I would shy away from that.
Can I come in just on the point that was made by Seamus there? And I think this is something where I live, for example, in North County Derry, there would be a sort of going from Garva across sort of Ballymoney direction towards Ballymena. That would be considered to be an area where Ulster Scots is quite strong, going into areas like Dunnoy and that. And I think that there's something important here, and I think we have to realise that there's a lot of, and Frank mentioned this earlier on, that there's a lot of similarities, in particular linguistic similarities. I mean, all we have to do is look at, and if I don't know, people use the term Hiberno English at times, but we have to look at words and phrases, etc., that we use in our everyday speech in English, that come from have their basis in Irish, but also are considered to be part of the Ulster Scots tradition. Take clabber, for example, the word for mud or muck. And I know it's a simple example, but it's important that people, if we're trying to open this conversation up, and if we're trying to make people more aware of the traditions that are around them, that we actually look at how to educate, or how to sort of show that this is not just because you're an Irish speaker and because you consider yourself part of an Irish language tradition that you aren't part of the of this other linguistic cultural tradition as well. There's no reason that you can't be participant in two. And there's no reason that there's aspects, because if we go back 1,000 years, linguistically, again, I mentioned earlier on along the north coast, linguistically, the Gaelic spoken there and in the Western Isles of Scotland were practically the same language. So I think it's very, very important that we don't, whereas we can look at the two traditions differently in terms of an approach and in terms of what should be done at governmental level, I do think there needs to be a bigger coming together of the traditions at a community level, and that we create a new approach to educating, particularly children, to something that's part of their everyday lives. They hear it all around them. They hear both. They hear the Irish language in the place names all around them, in surnames, in the structure of English that we use, in some of the vocabulary, and likewise they hear the influence of Ulster Scots. So I think that it's more a part than we actually think. It's more a part of our society than we may actually believe.
There's a very interesting question here from Maeve O'Brien, where she points out that sometimes even just in the process of things being driven by rights, you actually end up embedding the lesser and the greater in a way, paradoxically. But she says, are there other ways to ensure rights of languages outside of just involvement by validation of institutions? And she was thinking here in terms of the context of what Neil said around like for like. Are there things which you would like to see, I suppose, which you think are as important as getting the validation in the legal frame? Or are the things think the legal frame is actually the first thing, and then we get the other kinds of validations?
Is this for me or Frank?
Yeah, for Neil. Yeah.
I think that the key to language revival is a community-based approach, but a community-based, from the community upwards. So it can take you so far, but then you need the governmental support and you need the policy support, etc. So if is there anything else I would like to see? I would like to see the community get involved more. I mean, one of the key drivers of the Irish language movement from a very, very early stage was the idea of people working voluntarily. For example, with Conor na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League. I mean, I'm currently the president of the Gaelic League and of Conor na Gaeilge, and I do this all on a voluntary basis, as do an awful lot of my colleagues. I would like to see more of that, and I think that can be created by educating people better about the importance of language and the presence of language within the community, because this idea that everyone, and I'm deliberately avoiding the elephant in the room of politics and of green and orange politics, and I'm not going to go into a big conversation about that at all, but this idea that everyone on one side knows about Irish, has learned Irish, has an opportunity to learn Irish, that's not true. Whereas yes, a lot of people have had the opportunity. I just have to go back one generation to my mother's generation, when there was no Irish even available in school. So I think that yes, the governmental approach is important, but that doesn't matter unless you have the critical mass of speakers. And to create the critical mass of speakers, you need movements on the ground. You need people, enthusiasts. And I don't mean that in a, it's a pastime. That's not what I mean at all. I mean enthusiasts who believe in the importance of the language becoming a community language again. I don't know maybe if that answered your question, but to me, that is as important as legislation.
Yeah, it does. It goes some way towards it. And actually, there's a question from Stephen Carson, which talks in similar ways, where he says, getting out of the parallelism, and I maybe put this to Frank first, and you can come back, Neil, which is, what are the 2 or 3 things you think would be most important, if you like, to normalise and promote and sustain the kind of organic growth around Ulster Scots at this stage?
Yeah, I think it in many ways is quite paradoxical because we 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 can try and pretend that the political situation here doesn't exist and try and develop our language and culture and heritage around that. But often we need to take that on board. But I think one of the things that often a knowledge of Irish or a knowledge of Ulster Scots shows how complicated our history actually is, and often how intermixed and intertwined it is. So that's probably one thing to do. I think one of the things is to get beyond the stereotype of what Ulster Scots might actually represent. You know, immediately if you say Ulster Scots, and I've found this over a number of years, if you say you study Ulster Scots, you know that you're going to lose certain number of people in the room because they already assume that I am a number of things. And this is one of the things to get into the heart of where the language operates and its sort of lived quality. And one of those things I think is actually to step back from trying to give people a long lecture on Ulster Scots and show where it actually works and lives and is still living within the community. And I suppose one of the big things for Ulster Scots is its representation in schools, and not as a sort of a whataboutery thing that, because there's Irish, there has to be Ulster Scots, but to really understand our language and the language that we all speak and our children speaks a lot. A knowledge of Ulster Scots would actually help that process. And also that Ulster Scots is something about playing with the language and understanding those words and phrases. And Niall used clabber there. The word we talk about is crack, which, and the Scots are, on behalf of the Scots, they'd like their word back in a way.
There you go.
And one of the big problems is a lot of people get really angry about the spelling of crack. And the really sad thing is that crack is, I'll say this very carefully as I'm being recorded. The word crack meaning good times and whatever, and banter is a great, fantastic word. It's a fantastic community word. It's word full of life. And too often people get hung up on how you spell it. And I think that's one of our issues. So I think in a sense is to show actually the literary heritage of Ulster Scots, and to go and meet people and tell them about it, rather than letting people assume that the sort of unpleasant stereotype, which may not actually even exist.
Neil, do you have anything? I mean, specifically, I think that's really, really helpful. The kind of things you think might actually be important to foster the best ways to kind of foster the next stage of Irish development or growth.
Well, I mean, if I look at things that have succeeded in the Irish language, in the revival of the Irish language, and I have to point towards the development of Cairn Tuathair outside Mahara, and that has been a combination of a huge community effort and support. Not as much support as possibly we would like, but that has come from Irish medium education. And that has come from a combination of children who are receiving their education from nursery school, primary school, secondary school level onwards. We haven't reached third level yet, but hopefully, if the provost is listening in there, he might think about that. But in all seriousness, if you have the structure of any community, and particularly in rural communities, but the structure of any community is usually structured around the education system and the school. We have a situation in this local area where there are a number of Irish medium primary schools, nursery schools. Now there's a secondary school in Dungiven. Then you have all the community events that grow from the school community. For example, sports teams, concerts. You have the people who are employed in the schools, and this isn't. I mean, this idea that somehow this is like jobs for the boys. It's not. It's not at all. It's actually quite difficult, to develop this work. This creates a language community, which is supported, and I have to bring in a lot. the sporting community helps a lot as well, where you have, you know, in the situation of the Irish language situation outside, or sorry, the Irish language development outside Mahara, where you have the local sports teams, for example, the GAA teams, etc., who have been massively supportive of this. And you know, this has been created by a structure, and this is now has gone in a situation in the past 25 years where you have gone from the language being just a vague memory, something taught us at GCSE or in A-level in school. Maybe a couple of people went on to do Irish and became Irish teachers, but that was about it. Now I can bring my kids, for example, to their music class, or I can bring them to a music session, or I can bring them to sports training, or I can bring them to a concert, and a long list of things. And everything is done through the medium of Irish. Not everyone's absolutely fluent, but Irish is the main language, and this is the main language of communication. And I think that is the key to it. However, that cannot happen without the appropriate support from, you know, from the government. If it had been just purely a voluntary movement, I'm not sure if we, you know, could have been taken this far. But definitely the community approach is vital. And, you know, I think that that's the key in terms of Irish anyway. But I am aware, I know that, you know, Ulster Scots has a very, very different set of needs, and that's important. We have to keep in mind that these are two. I don't like saying the word separate because I want to use, you know, I want to keep this is an inclusive. We have to look at this inclusively, but at the same time, you know, we also have to be aware that the cultures and traditions are at two different stages of development.
Equality doesn't mean treating people the same. It means giving people what they need appropriately.
Yeah.
I'm going to take. There's a couple of really interesting questions here, which take us into slightly more, kind of slightly different, distinctive areas. Another one from Maeve, which is, I suppose, really for Frank, which is saying, you know, how important are things like Dairy Girls, is basically what Maeve is asking. Things where there are kind of more modern, up-to-date versions of people actually operating out of a kind of a background where Ulster Scots is part of the fabric.
I think Dairy Girls is really, really important because in a sense it doesn't set out in any shape or form to say that it's about Ulster Scots, but the vocabulary there leans very, very heavily on the imprint of Scots in Derry, and it works very, very naturally there. And I think it's probably one of those things that the people in the Ulster Scots broadcast industry have probably been trying to get for years, and it just came from a different point of view. I think one of the things that often Ulster Scots language activism has been aimed at a certain demographic, and in many ways trying to revive the 1790s. And I think while that's important to acknowledge the heritage of those times, to actually have something that's living and breathing in 2020 and is funny and using the wonderful language and situations it does, and destroys the sort of idea that Ulster